Ja, herzlich willkommen zum Höhepunkt unserer Eröffnungsveranstaltung heute. We are delighted to present to you our keynote speaker for the evening, Amalia Levi, who's joining us from Bonn tonight, where she currently works at the Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies at the University of Bonn. Amalia Levi is an archivist and cultural heritage professional working with the non-profit Heritage Connection. She has worked in numerous projects processing and digitizing archival collections. She holds master degrees in history, library science, and museum science. And her research focuses on unearthing marginalized people who are usually invisible in archives by weaving together different types of information to go beyond archival documents. All of this predestines her to be our keynote speaker tonight. And please allow me to add and to stress, as it is International Women's Day today, and as I am working in an archive that is dedicated to the works of a single white male author, let me stress the importance of telling all the untold stories, not only of women, but the importance of telling all the untold stories that our archives hold and all the untold stories that our archives don't hold. Let me stress the importance of addressing the bias that can be found in our collections and the bias that can be found in our data. Because the collections and the data that we build today shape the Erinnerungskultur of tomorrow. And I'm very sure that your talk, Amalia, will address these topics, as it is called Filling the Gaps, Digital Humanities as Restorative Justice. It is great to have you here, Amalia. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me. It is truly an honor to be with you today. And particularly, I would like to thank Professor Trilke. I am joining you today from Bonn, where I am currently conducting archival research and doctoral research on my particular topic. First of all, let me tell you, I am amazed at all the wonderful workshops and presentations at the conference. And I was expecting that I would be talking to 40 or 50 people, and I think I forgot how big Germany is really. So my talk today will draw on two strands. First of all, my work as a practicing archivist in and with colonial archives. And the second strand is my doctoral research on the community of enslaved people in Jewish households in Bridgetown, Barbados, which I just started this October, and that is why I'm now spending part of my time in Bonn. I am also privileged to have the support and the funding to be able to do this project, to unearth silenced and dehumanized and marginalized people. And of course, I would like to thank, with this opportunity, the Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies for providing me with the funding and the intellectual community to make this project possible. Because after all, we are all products of the friendships and the support from our friends and colleagues. I will now share my screen. So, a small overview of my presentation. I will do a small introduction. I will talk about cultural memory and digitization, specifically memory in colonial and colonial archives, digital humanities projects and methods for reparative and restorative work, and then we'll offer some thoughts and suggestions. Please, at any moment, if you cannot hear me well or if you have a question, feel free to ask. So we are here today, and one of the themes of the conference is collecting and archiving, remembering and commemorating. How is cultural memory changing in the age of digitization? And as someone who has completed more than 35,000 pages of digitization, I would actually like to tell you that digitization is secondary. Because while we digitize and we put things online, whatever we do not digitize is being, and particularly in the global south, archives, libraries, museums, and the objects they hold, they are crumbling or they are being eaten by insects or destroyed by natural disasters. We cannot forget, obviously, that in recent years, we have lost so much that was not digitized and for which we did not really have good inventories or finding aids. Let's not forget the fire in the National Museum of Brazil, the Folk Center in St. Lucia. These are all things that where we will never know really what was lost, simply because there were not any kinds of catalogs, at least item level or good ones. And of course, let's not go far away, because right now we are in the middle of the war, and our colleagues in Ukraine are trying to protect their cultural heritage in museums and archives that are being bombed every day. So as I was doing, I was preparing the slides for this presentation, and we were all horrified by the advance of the Russian troops and the shelling of the nuclear power plant. I have been thinking, what is the role of digital humanities in a world gone mad? What do we create and what do we produce? And what do we lift and what we conceal? More specifically, there have been, recent initiatives, digital humanities, that are activist and are aiming towards social justice. For example, in the US, an activist project using digital humanities methods to interrogate the involvement of big money in the work of ICE, and of course a project that the people who worked on it are calling Mobilized Humanities, using digital tools to equip broad social awareness and help in global critical situations. Other projects, for example, projects that show the flow of immigrants and the refugee crisis towards Europe. And then just these past days, the SUCO project, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, again, a community of activists who are using digital humanities tools to save Ukrainian cultural heritage online, which are all wonderful opportunities. But of course, again, my archivist side will say, when we focus on the digital and the digitized, we lose sight of what is left behind. In fact, digitization can be misleading. It gives us a false sense of comprehensiveness, that what we see online is actually pretty much everything. It gives us a false sense of security, that what is online will be there 500 years from now. And again, a false sense of ease of access, because people who have good internet connection have good access, while people in the global south, for example, many people in Latin America, but especially in Africa, are unable to access digitized material that belong to their cultures, because they do not have enough broadband. Also, thinking in terms of big data is privileged. The vast majority, and when I say the vast majority, I mean the vast majority of archives, museum, and library collections are not digitized. So when we base our research on digitized material, we only see a very small part of the historical record, and our sample is never representative. We must not forget that digitization is partial. It is always selective. It favors two-dimensional objects, written documents and images, and does not integrate so much material culture, audio or video. And of course, because of that, it perpetuates and reproduces silences in the historical record. If we, a little bit to represent this idea graphically, if we assume that there is a whole of the human past and that due to natural and man-made disasters, only some part of it becomes the historical record, and then only some part of it is preserved in archives and libraries, then there is a further selection, what will be digitized, which of course has to do with a lot of criteria, selection criteria. And then of course, what you see online, it is only a very, very small part of that vast historical record. Also, digitization is partial, not only because of selection criteria, but because also is a very resource intensive endeavor. It is expensive, it is time consuming, it's resource intensive, it requires people and money. It requires, of course, planning and institutional support, because let's not forget that I bet all of us have discs or CD-ROMs in our houses that we cannot play anymore. So it requires institutional support to make that legible 100 years from now, and long-term preservation. And of course, it has a low return on investment in the sense that it is so expensive that you cannot really sell images and fund digitization. And that means, of course, that only bigger institutions can do really massive digitization projects. Smaller institutions and marginalized communities are disadvantaged in this respect. Of course, another aspect is that digitization, digitization obscures. Let's not forget that documents are scanned as images, especially for older documents, before 19th century documents that are OCR does not really give great results. And there are initiatives like Transcribus, but that is not a generalized approach yet. There are metadata that promote the creator. So metadata do not reveal all the people that are in the records, but they favor those who created the records, who of course is the elite. And usually, of course, metadata carry offensive legacy descriptions that digitization, when it is done without being uninterrogatedly, simply reinforces. Because of that, voiceless populations remain locked away still. They cannot be found. Particularly, let's look a little bit to colonial archives, and with a focus on the Caribbean. Colonial archives, I will talk particularly about the archives of the British Empire, because that is my area of research right now, but you can extrapolate some of the points that I will make to other archives of colonial archives of France, Germany, Belgium, since they also operated at the imperial level. So empire needed to be able to rule and administer vast amounts of land. And of course, we have distance, we have time, and we have the administrative machinery who was doing that by creating information and by creating data. By producing records, the empire was able to set and administer boundaries. It was able to enumerate, classify, and categorize people and create race and classes. And of course, to establish who was included or excluded from that empire. It was able to reward and punish. And most importantly, it was using the paper records to consolidate, legitimize, and protect the property of the elites. And in this sense, also produced race, gender, class, and belonging. To do that over vast swathes of the earth, of course, you can imagine that the result is voluminous records. And in this sense, the empire enacted archival violence. It mediated what was to be written and what was left off the official record. It structured information and standardized it to reflect imperial aspirations. It made things accessible or inaccessible depending on the user. Decided where things would be stored physically back then, of course. And of course, it decided also which records they would preserve or destroy. This archival violence resulted in archival silences in the records. And when I say archival silences, I do not really mean that there is no information about marginalized actors, but that this information needs specific attention and specific tools to be found. In my doctoral research, one aspect that I am developing is the theme of archival dependencies. You will excuse some of the slides will have a lot of text, others not so much. So I have to write this to make it more intelligible. I argue that archives are the institutional background that determines which voices will be preserved in the historical record. And of course, colonial archives create and maintain asymmetrical dependencies among dependent actors. Some actors are heard more than others, and some are completely silenced. Of course, archival dependencies do not only exist in the analog world. With every reformatting, be microfilming or digitization or datafication, they cascade down and they are perpetuated. So dominant voices are being perpetuated, and what is not there already, it is obscured more. So digitization perpetuates these asymmetrical dependencies of data. The post-colonial Caribbean, just to go back on the ground, at the end of the 19th century, we have an array of islands that belong to different colonial powers. The majority was the United Kingdom, the British Empire. This is a wonderful project of visualization project. And then we see that these countries at the end, some earlier, others later, after especially the 50s and the 60s, many of these countries become independent. And of course, the question is, what happens to the archives of those countries, archives that were created on the ground or about them? And the answer is that the archives pretty much go through process of removal from the colonies. And we have different processes of removal or of change. So we have some of the records that were simply destroyed. These were records that were incriminating for the government of Her Majesty, as the circular said. And so a lot was burned or thrown to the ocean. For example, if I'm not mistaken, in Africa, in one of the colonies, it is said that 3 tons of paper was burned and was destroyed. Other archives that went to London were misplaced. They were missing and not possible to locate. And it was only in 2011 that it became known the amount of material that was simply not traceable. A vast part of the records were taken from the colony to the metropole right before independence, and it is still being kept there. And other records still exist that are classified and are not accessible. So what is accessible, you will ask maybe, and what is extant records? Some records are accessible in person. These are called legacy files. They are still in the post-colonies. And some are non-classified records in the metropole. Some are accessible online, partial and selectively. And then some are hidden simply because either they are uncatalogued or you cannot find it easily, you cannot do a search for them, or they are simply lost. In short, seeing the vast amount of destruction and the archival violence enacted, this means that if you find something in the archives, it was meant to be found. You will not find it by chance, and you will not you will usually not find something that you were not supposed to find. Because of this, research on slavery is particularly fraught with, it's very problematic, simply because any kind of data that has to do with slavery should be interrogated. In fact, there is this poignant phrase by Jessica Marie Johnson in her article, Markup Bodies. There is no bloodless data in slavery's archive. Data is the evidence of terror. And the idea of data as fundamental and objective information obscures rather than reveals the scene of the crime. So data is the evidence of terror because simply it shows you what you have in front of you and how much actually has been lost. These archival silences, in fact, are produced at every step of the way. Michel Rolf-Trouillot has said it's created at the time of fact creation, at the time of fact assembly, which is the making of the archives, at the time of fact retrieval, the work that we do to create narratives, and then at the time of providing retrospective significance, the making and the writing of history. In this sense, digital humanities, which is humanities work using digital tools, digital humanities can exacerbate silences, and it can perpetuate imperial legacies. Because if we just work with material that have been simply violently reduced, we exacerbate these silences without interrogating them. Using digital humanities tools, though, we can repair the historical record and restore some marginalized people in history. Some here I will not show all projects that are doing that. It will be only very few projects. The Real Face of White Australia uses facial recognition to lift images of people who were deemed undesirable in their Australian records. One More Voice also lifts voices, non-elite colonial voices. Another project, the Open Restitution Project, collects information and data in Africa, and they seek to collect information for restitution of African material culture, and it aims to empower stakeholders. The aim is to overcome the dispersion of this material mostly in European museums. Another way that digital humanities tools are being used is to reconstruct lost worlds. And here is a project about the Julfa cemetery, an Armenian cemetery that was destroyed by 2006 by Russian forces. It has been razed to the ground, but a team of researchers is collecting archival information and whatever information there is out there to digitally reconstruct it. In this line, I just will show one slide of my work, my research, which is about finding enslaved people in Jewish households in Bridgetown, Barbados. You see here the synagogue and the cemetery. And my work has to do with locating an undocumented network of people based on a well-documented Jewish network. The tools that I will be using is prosopography for this network and some network analysis, and then combining different kinds of information on the map, not only archival records, but material culture also. And at the end, create a data set that other scholars will be able to build upon and use for further projects, and to create a project that will be beneficial for the public, for the local public in Barbados, but also for the Synagogue Historic District and its visitors. Some suggestions when working with digital humanities tools about unearthing marginalized populations. First of all, to go against archival silences, we need to be deliberate. If the record does not exist, and if you do not find populations that should be there, then we have to create it retrospectively. We cannot expect that it will appear and we will see it. Let's not forget also the many layers of meaning in an archival document. Of course, there is what is said and the content itself, but then there is also so much what is not said, what is alluded to, what is hidden by chance or intentionally, what is misleading or what is ambiguous. If we use digital humanities tools in a positivist way, we usually only lift the content of an archival document, and we should go beyond what is said to find other information therein, so as not to lose all the other different layers in the records. For example, I will show you an example of what I meant when I said that documents that are hiding voices and are, for example, this is a manumission volume. These are records from Jamaica. I am also working with manumission records, but I cannot show you any images because simply it was not allowed for me to take images. So I had to transcribe everything by hand. But this has been digitized by an Endangered Archives grant in Jamaica. So what you see here is an item, a volume. You will see here the description. It's described as one item, but it has 300 pages, and every page has approximately from 1 up to 3 or more names of enslaved people. So while this is described as one item, there are at least 300 plus names of enslaved people that are locked in the digitized images. And these are all historical records. The paper is not in a good shape. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen pages that are discolored and have been eaten by termites. So it's not always easy to make handwritten text recognition. Another thing that I would like to emphasize is then not to rush to create big data sets, but to appreciate slow research. Essentially pay attention to what is not there. Not only what you find, but what you did not find. and ask why you did not find it, and also ask how these silences came to be. This can be much more helpful for digital humanities work than simply finding something that is there. For this, embrace hybridity. Do not only work with digital collections and don't simply expect for things to be digitized, but include analog records and material culture in your work. And even if it's not digitized, try to turn it into data through the collections as data approach. Also, don't be daunted by the volume of the material. It is true that colonial archives contain thousands, if not millions of papers, but the empire is banal. Most of the documents are mundane, they are boring and repetitive, and they are not meant to be creative. They are only meant to count, and usually they use standardized texts. So we can simply find some gold nuggets of information there is. To go back to that manumission volume that you saw, every manumission record is pretty much uses the same standardized text in the context of the British Empire. The same text can be found in the North American colonies, for example, in Boston, and the same text can be found in Jamaica, because simply that was the way that the empire was working. Also, talking about standardization, value the outliers and welcome differences. It can be frustrating many times to work with things that are not standardized, but in fact, we should welcome singularity, exceptionality, and surprise, because they are very generative for our work. Also, be intentional with the digital methods. For example, use them to increase awareness of what is hidden, not to shed light so much at what you were able to find, but what is not there and how you might be able to show it. You can emphasize data dependencies, how information arrived to us, through which hoops it went through until we see it on paper or on the screen. And of course, again, through digital tools, you can make visible these legacies of empire. Another way that we can, that digital humanities can help us is that it can allow us to be vocal about our data sets. We cannot speak, having seen the amount of archival violence that goes into archives and library collections. We can, of course, not talk about neutrality, objectivity of our information. We cannot talk about representativeness, and we cannot talk about comprehensiveness. A priori, we start with data sets that are not neutral and are not comprehensive. And this is something that we need to emphasize and stress. We can highlight, in fact, the assumptions and the conventions that we used to create our data sets, and acknowledge that our data sets are and will always be biased, that there are things there that are not to be found. And maybe if we put an emphasis on that, other scholars can come and work with our data and add upon it, and then show the logics of the data, what is going on with the data that we have collected. Of course, I want here to also to show you that, as I said previously, it was not only the British Empire that had colonial archives. The German, Germany also had has colonial legacies, and this is a wonderful project that brings together Deutsche Kolonialgeschichte. It provides guides for material that is there. It provides the possibility to find material based on a map search, thesaurus of people and institutions. And it also has a very nice section that it explains the limitations of this information and simply shows why and how things cannot be found. In fact, in that section, you will see at the bottom the material, the geographical places the material come from. But one of the most important things that I find in that site is that it shows you essentially that banality of empire and bureaucracy, and it shows you how records moved from one agency to the other. That gives you an idea of the relationships between records, and this is something that can be again generative for digital humanities projects to show the relationships between the creators, the agencies, and the activities that gave birth to these records. You can see up there all the different agencies that the records moved through. Another way that digital humanities methods can be useful for this kind of work is that it allows us to conduct ethnographies of data sets. If we have a digital collection, we can simply ask what collection is it derived from, and is it and how it came to be, who were the creators, when was the collection reformatted, who funded the reformatic work, which is something obviously that has a lot of implications for the way that the collection is accessed or not. And of course, where is it hosted? And what was included and what was excluded. This will help us understand better our data set. Also, by putting our attention on how resources were created and how resources circulated among agencies in the colonial state, we can also show different constellations of records and how they are related by a common creator, which can be the agency, the producing agency, a common source of acquisition, a common subject or format, or even an event or activity. This can help us show novel relationships and dependencies beyond what simply we see on a screen, that sometimes can depend on the access systems or the content management system an archives or a library might have in place. As collections become data, and as collections and as we start applying, for example, even other technologies such as machine learning technologies, one thing that we need to be aware of and to cultivate is responsibility, so that our work, especially when we are dealing with big data, is based on equity and justice, and so that we don't simply lift things that are well known, but we help users find under-discovered data sets. We allow community participation in a non-exploitative way, and we collaborate with multiple people. And if you want to read more about machine learning in libraries and archives, there is a great new report by Ryan Cordell that reports on the state of the field. But of course, the most important thing, I will go back to what I said previously, do not rely only on digitized material. Go visit archives and libraries and go engage with analog collections. Yes, of course. Nobody said that working with analog material is easy. Working with digitized stuff is much easier and convenient. We can do it from our couch in our house, but it can never compare working with analog material. Going to the archives and the museums, we can feel the place and the space, because then our human nature and the logistics of the building, the lack of time, and the physicality of our research oblige us to be mindful. We need to count for every second and everything that we do. Immerse yourself in the environment, which is not only the building or the collections, but also the nature that surrounds you in the place that you will do your research. And a very enriching opportunity is to meet with local researchers, amateur historians or genealogists, and people simply who are from that place and who know that place better or deeper than any outsider scholar might know. And most of all, allow serendipity, which means that usually at the end of this research, you will see and you will understand that you do not find things, but actually things find you. And I cannot explain that, but this is a matter of serendipity. And this is what happens when you work with analog material. I will again stress that you need to collaborate with local scholars and practitioners who might not have the funding or the opportunities that we scholars in the global north might have. What you can do is share funding, expertise, and know-how. You can help promote the protection of collections, and you can engage the local public in your work. I will again repeat that many times, even in archival projects that are meant to be non-extractive and are but end up being hosted in institutions in the global north, people in the global south cannot access or do not know that material of their culture exists digitized elsewhere. At the same time, we need to be respectful and avoid neocolonialism when working with local scholars or with the local public. Something that many times we tend to do without really understanding it. Let's not forget that you have power, and that essentially the history that gets funded is the one that gets written eventually. So if you have funding, you can use it to tell stories that are not told, that you cannot find, but you know should be there. Again, as digital humanists, we must not forget that the data we produce might end up polluting our planet. So the Manifesto for Digital Humanities and the Climate Crisis asks, are we doing enough to resist the perceived ethereality of the digital, when the reality is stuff, power, and pollution? I will conclude by again reminding you the dire situation that cultural heritage finds itself beyond digitization. And yet again, I will repeat that what we need is good documentation and protection of heritage collections, and that digitization again creates false impressions and in a sense is secondary to what we need to do for heritage. And I will thank you for your attention, and I will welcome questions or comments.